My name is Peter Halas. I was born on the 28th of October 1939 in Budapest, Hungary, and it was just about a month after the Second World War started. All right. So I was born into a family. My mother and my father, we lived in a very nice apartment on the high side of Budapest, on the Buda side, and my father worked for his father-in-law, my grandfather, who had a large oriental carpet business, and we had a very good life. Hungary was an ally of the Germans, so Hungary wasn't invaded by the Germans like Czechoslovakia, Austria, or Poland was, and life continued as far as I know, or for us, life continued just as before. And while the war was going on elsewhere, Hungary was still a peaceful place, or Budapest was a peaceful place. Until about 1942, when my father was conscripted into a labor battalion, and he was taken to Russia. Life was suddenly very tough for him. We still lived pretty well in Budapest. My grandfather had his shop, business was still okay, and food, etc., was, as far as I understand, available. But my father's life turned around. In the labor battalion, where he was taken by himself and his two brothers, and life was brutal. The cold was immense. It was minus 28, minus 30, minus 35 degrees in the winter. I tell people when they ask me how cold that is, because in Australia we don't experience that, but if you spit, by the time it hits the ground, it's ice. He was very lucky because they wanted people who could drive trucks. And while not many people in those days knew how to drive a car, today young kids get their driver's license when they're 17 in Sydney, and because they're likely to get a car shortly after. But in Hungary, not many people owned cars, so my father was lucky. He had a driver's license. He volunteered to drive their truck, and that saved his life because he was sitting inside the cabin instead of being out in the open. His two brothers perished in those circumstances. But like I said, our life was quite normal. And I remember my mother going shopping. We went shopping together. I remember going to the synagogue with my grandfather on Saturday mornings. And I wasn't aware that there was a war going on. And this was like this until March 1944. So by then I was 4 years old, soon to be 5, when the Germans, on their way back from Russia, being defeated in Russia and retreating back into Germany, occupied Hungary. The Nazis wanted to know why the Hungarian Jews were not affected by the war. They were not deported yet. And the Hungarian government was replaced. A new government was put in place, who suddenly started to collect all the Jews first from the villages and from the small cities, and eventually from Budapest. I remember my grandfather and my mother trying to get passports to leave Hungary, but of course by then it was far, far too late. And later on I heard the stories how they had opportunities to leave, but my grandfather said, "Why would I leave? Life is good here." But unfortunately, they didn't. So when they saw that people are being deported and people are being taken away, they decided to go into hiding. I went into hiding with my mother. An Armenian family who was a friend of my grandparents decided to hide us, and we got a small room in their apartment, and we were staying there from about June onwards. And my grandparents were hiding somewhere else in the city. Life was becoming tough. Food was very short. Every time a truck stopped in front of the building, we were worried that they're coming for us. Every time there was a knock on the door, we got worried. And Jewish people weren't allowed out onto the streets after a certain time, I think after 4 o'clock. And if they went onto the streets, they had to wear the yellow star. On the 15th of December 1944, my mother decided to visit my grandfather, where he was hiding out because it was his birthday. And it was in the evening. She shouldn't have gone because it was forbidden for Jews to be on the street, but she went. I stayed at home because I had a cold. And she kissed me goodbye, and that was the last time I saw her. My mother visited my grandparents, and while she was visiting them, there was a raid on the building by the Nazis, Hungarian Nazis, not German Nazis. And all the people in the building, all the Jewish people in the building were taken down and eventually marched to the banks of the Danube, and they were all shot, including my mother and grandparents. We know what has happened because there's a young boy amongst them, and he pleaded with one of the Nazis and to say, "I'm just a young kid, please don't shoot me." And this Nazi gave him a shove in the butt, and he fell in the river before the shooting started. And eventually he clambered out after everything was over. He came back and he told us what had happened. You can imagine the shock that we all felt. My hosts, as well as of course me, suddenly my father I haven't seen my father for 3 years, and my mother is now gone. And my host was worried that maybe our building will be next, that will be raided. So next morning he put me on his shoulder, and he walked me across Budapest about 25 kilometers to the outskirts, and found a Christian couple who decided to take me in and hide me with them. They didn't have children, and when he told them that my parents are probably both dead, they decided that they are happy to have me and maybe adopt me. It was a pretty terrible time in Budapest because Budapest was being attacked by the Russians on the ground and by the Americans from the air. So there were daily bombings, carpet bombings. And carpet bombing is when you look up in the sky, there are airplanes wing to wing, and suddenly they release their bombs all at once. You rush down into the cellar to save yourself, but you don't know if the building above you is going to be bombed, and maybe you'll never be able to come back up again. The Russians were on the ground, and they kept attacking. We were on the eastern side of Budapest, so we got probably liberated before the rest of Budapest. And I remember the Russian soldiers coming and bring us food, and suddenly life was looking a lot happier. The people who I was with were very kind and they were lovely, and like I said, they wanted to adopt me. About a month or two after liberation of Budapest, my grandmother, my father's mother, who was in the ghetto with my grandfather, with her husband, came and found me and claimed me. She said to these people, "Look, as far as I know, my 3 sons are dead. My other grandchild we know that he's gone. Peter is the only relation I have. I'm going to have him." And they had a bit of a fight because this couple really wanted to adopt me, and they said, "What does an old woman want with a young kid like that?" But she was adamant, and I went with her. And life started to return to normal. Eventually, people started to clear away the rubble. Public transport started, trams started, buses started. My grandfather was a headmaster in a public school, and he went back to work, and the school opened, and I went to school. As far as we knew, we had no one else left except the 3 of us from quite a large family. But in June, this is about 3-4 months after I went to live with my grandmother, was a knock on the door, and when we opened the door, my father stood there. And he was very thin and sick, but he was alive. He was taken from the Russian front to Bergen Belsen, and he stayed in Bergen Belsen for a while, and then eventually they took him to Theresienstadt, and he was liberated there, and he made his way back to Budapest to learn that his wife was no longer alive, his parents-in-law were no longer alive, his brothers were gone. And I just cannot imagine how he must have felt when he found out all these terrible events. But you know, people's optimism is great, and looking forward is more important than looking backward. And we started life again as a family, the four of us. Eventually he decided that I must have a mother, and he started to look around to find another partner. And in 1946, about a year and a half after he arrived back, he met my stepmother, who also lost her husband to the Holocaust. And they got married in December 1946. And again, we started to live like a more normal family. He reopened the business that my grandfather had, and life was really becoming quite normal. We went on holidays. In 1947, September, my brother was born, and I was going to school. The buildings were being rebuilt. Budapest was being rebuilt. Until 1950. In 1950, there was a communist takeover in Hungary, and life became quite tough again. The Russians took virtually everything. They took all the food, they took machinery from the factories, and my father's business was struggling, and eventually in 1951, one night, I was asleep. It was the middle of the night, I was asleep, and I woke up to people talking, and I got out of bed and I went to the next room. And there were a couple of men talking to my father. My father looked very worried, and I just had no idea what was happening. But what really happened was that they wanted to nationalize his business, and they came middle of the night to accuse him of hoarding gold. And he said, there was a law in Hungary by the communists to say that you can't have more than 500 grams of gold jewelry. And they found all the jewelry he had, and it didn't amount to more than about 300 grams. But they said, you must be hiding the rest. He said, I'm not hiding it. This is what I have. I don't have any more. Anyway, they accused him of hiding gold, took his business away, and jailed him for 18 months. So after coming out of Bergen Belsen and Theresienstadt and suffering through the war, he was now jailed by the communists for absolutely no crime that he committed. Food was very short. We were living mostly on beans and potatoes. And one of the funny stories is that I went to camp with the school, and each of us had to carry something for the camp, and I was given a rucksack with some bread in it. And as we were walking, I kept reaching back and taking bread out and eating. And by the time we got to the camp, there was only half the bread left, so they weren't happy. But we were hungry. We were hungry a lot of the time. In 1953, probably the biggest event of that time was when Stalin died. And suddenly it felt that the communists have loosening their hold on power, and there was a feeling of maybe there'll be more freedom from now. It started mostly with the university students, and the university students were making demands, and there was a change of a few of the ministers, and a few of the government officials were changed, and everyone felt that suddenly there is some breath of freedom. Up to then, we couldn't get foreign newspapers, we couldn't listen to the radio from the West, We couldn't watch, there was no television, of course, but there was very little communication with the West. And suddenly we could hear radio broadcasts from the West. There were some newspapers from the West that appeared, and generally news came through. And it's the old story, when you give someone an inch, they take a foot. So that, the more freedom was released, or the most freedom were given by the government, the more freedom was demanded. And in 1956, in October 1956, I skipped school with some of my friends and went to the movies. And we came out of the movies, there was a demonstration walking down the middle of Budapest, and there must have been tens of thousands of people marching. There were flags with the Russian star cut out from the middle, and there were placards with demands that the students made on the government. The Russians should leave Hungary, there should be more freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of universities, freedom of people. And they marched we actually, my friends and I joined the march, and we marched to the radio station, where they wanted someone to go to the radio station and make the demands heard on radio. Instead of allowing that to happen, they started shooting at us from the windows of the radio station. So some of the students went to a nearby army barracks, and they convinced the commander of the barracks to join what we now call the Hungarian Revolution. And they gave out guns, and they started shooting back, and suddenly there was a shooting war going on. So we're back to where we finished in 1945 or 1944. The battle didn't last long, maybe 2 or 3 days, and it seemed that the revolution has won. The Russians withdrew, and everyone was elated. They thought, this is fantastic, Hungary is free again. And unfortunately, it didn't last long. About 2 or 3 days later, we woke up one morning to the rumblings of guns, of tanks, and the Russians invaded Budapest, and they were brutal. They went from street to street with the tanks shooting. Each tank was one behind the other. One was the gun was pointing one way, the one behind was pointing the other way, and they'd go through a street and bomb the street, and every building in the street would collapse. These are small buildings in the narrow streets in Budapest. There was a lot of fighting, especially the students. There were students who stood on tops of, jumped down from windows on tops of tanks, opened the turret and threw grenades in, blowing the tank up. There's kids who pulled grenades under the tank so they would blow up. Anyhow, the revolution was over, the Russians won, and middle of November, this is about 3 weeks after the revolution was over, a friend of mine rang me and said, would you like to come with us? We're going to try to escape from Hungary. And the Hungarian borders were sealed. You couldn't get in or out. It was barbed wires and mines. But during the revolution, they picked up the mines and the barbed wire. And so I decided to join these guys. And next morning, we set off to try to get to Austria. And it took, first we went by train, then we heard that the train is probably going to be raided by the police. So then we got off and we walked for 3 nights. We didn't want to walk during the day. We hid in farmers' barns, but at night we walked. Eventually, we thought we might be lost, but we found our way and we got to the Austrian border, and eventually we heard German voices and we realized that we've made it. I was taken by the Red Cross to a camp, and they asked me, what do you want to do now? And I said, look, I went through a war, I went through a revolution. I don't want to stay in Europe, I want to get away as far as I can. And they said, well, that's Australia. And so I applied to come to Australia. I had medicals and various things, and it took 7 months for the papers that allowed me to come here arrive. And one night they came to tell me that there is a ship going from Marseille to Sydney. And next morning we boarded the train from Salzburg, and it was going across the Alps, which was absolutely beautiful, the most beautiful train ride I've ever done. And then we got down to Genoa, and Genoa is a port city in Italy, and that was the first time I saw the ocean, the first time I saw a palm tree. Someone handed me a banana, the first time I saw a banana or tasted one. And then the train took us to Marseille, where the ship was sailing from. And it was an American naval boat that was decommissioned in Korea. And because it was a naval boat, they didn't have any staff except for the sailors who ran the ship. So they asked us if we would work on the ship, and I volunteered as a cleaner. And they paid me $3 a day. So 28 days later, when we arrived to Sydney, I had $90 American, which is an absolute fortune then. We had some friends in Sydney. My parents had some friends who waited for me at the ship, and they rented a small room for me in someone's apartment. And when we came through the heads and under the bridge, I said, this is where I want to live, this is gorgeous. And next morning I woke up and I found myself, I had no idea where I was, but as I walked out, happened to be in Kirribilli. So I was right next to the bridge. It was just fantastic. The sun, it was a June day and the sun was shining, and they told me this was winter, but this is not the winter I knew. And it took me a day or two to find a job. I was working, I didn't speak any English, so I found a job in a warehouse where I was shifting boxes from left to right and right to left. I enrolled in night school so I could learn a bit of English. And it took me about 3 to 4 months to come to a stage where I could actually make myself understood and could hold a conversation. And then I was working at various jobs. I was a waiter. I worked in a chemical factory where they were making peroxide, so my hair went all blonde. I was working in lots of different... Eventually I decided that I'm pretty good at convincing people to buy stuff, so I decided I wanted to be a salesman. And I joined a clothing company and became a salesman. And eventually I was working for a swimwear company where they asked me to become a partner in the business. They liked the way I was working. And after 8 years in that business, I decided that I wanted to start my own. And in 1975, Yvonne and I started up a business that we called Seafolly, and started manufacturing swimwear. My wife and I met in 1960, so about 3 years after I arrived to Australia. We got married very quickly within about 9 months of meeting. We had 2 children, one in 1963 and one in 1967, who now have 3 children each. And life was pretty good. So after a very tough start, we made ourselves a really good life here.